Welcome back. Sorry, I had to send my people away. The first ways that we are going to classify plays are by duration and by genre. Now, with duration, historically in Western drama, plays tend to run, a full-length play tends to run about 2 to 3 hours. And that amount of time is not arbitrary, okay? It represents roughly the time between lunch and dinner, or roughly the time between dinner and bedtime. And in fact, it was Shakespeare himself in the play A Midsummer Night's Dream, writing the character of Theseus, when he said that he wanted a play between 2 and 3 hours. So that amount of time is not arbitrary. And it's been like that for a long, long time. Now, that, of course, does not necessarily mean that all plays are that length. Plays can be shorter or longer, depending on the context. In fact, the shortest play on record is a play called Breath, written by Samuel Beckett, who we will talk about when we discuss modern theater, or the beginnings of modern theater and theater of the absurd. But his play Breath is a play that is less than a minute long. So, and on the other end of that, we can go to extremely long plays, plays like Tom Stoppard's Coast of Utopia, or the Mahabharata by Peter Brook, which we'll also talk about Mahabharata when we talk about theater history in the East. Tony Kushner's Angels in America. These plays are day-long events, 6-hour plus events. So it just depends on what your context is. It depends on what you're trying to do. But most of the time, a full-length play will run approximately 2 to 3 hours. Now, the other way that we classify things is by genre. Genre is a French word. It is a word that means kind, right? Like classifying something by its kind. I mentioned to you originally in this lecture that it was the root word of gender, which is, I think, interesting. But genre is important because it helps people to understand whether they want to see a play or not, right? It kind of goes in line with personal taste, right? Classifying a play by its genre. It's like, oh, is it funny? Oh, is it serious? Oh, is it a musical? Is it something experimental? Whatever it might be. Now, historically, we have two forms of genre. We have tragedy and comedy. Tragedy, though, doesn't just mean sad. I want to be very clear about that. It doesn't just mean, oh, it's tragedy. That's not really what it meant. Tragedy is a very specific set of rules that guided, specifically when it was created, things like Greek drama. So what were those rules? Well, Aristotle was the first person to come up with the rules for tragedy in his very famous book, Poetics. Now, in Poetics, this is what he said had to be a part of tragedy. First of all, the central character has got to be someone of high rank. We're not talking about normal, everyday people here. We're talking about kings and generals and queens and so on and so forth. That person's fortune declines, which leads to suffering, right? And most of the time, death. Now, the reason that happens is because of what Aristotle called the fundamental flaw, or the hamartia, and the protagonist's recognition of that flaw, which is what has led to their demise. And the outcome of that demise, whether it be death or destruction or whatever it might be, is supposed to create what Aristotle calls pity and fear in the audience, which leads the audience to Aristotle's concept of catharsis. That's where we get the word. Catharsis, meaning we understand something new about ourselves by watching the misfortunes of others. It's instructional, right? The purpose is to inform and instruct about morality, about respect for the gods, about the way that we should live and not live, right? So from its very earliest, the point here being, from its very earliest inceptions, theater has always kind of been, in one form or another, an agent for some kind of social change. It's an interesting concept to talk about. Where was I? I just lost my spot. Oh, yeah. A prime example, of course, of tragedy and following that format would be Oedipus. That's one of the best examples. Also, the Oresteia with Agamemnon. We see Agamemnon having a fundamental flaw, which is why his wife Clytemnestra kills him. And we see Clytemnestra having a fundamental flaw, which is revenge, which is why she ends up dying at the hands of Orestes, right? So we're able to kind of follow that structure based on most Greek tragedies. The one exception to that rule would be some of the works of Euripides, which, as we mentioned early on, are a little bit radical. If you look at something like Medea, we see Medea wreaking all this havoc in people's lives as an act of revenge for the way that she's been treated and basically imprisoned and mistreated by her husband, emotionally abused. And so she kills everybody and runs off with her dead children in a chariot of fire. And the fact that she lives and gets away with it is a sort of fundamental break from the tradition, which back in those days, traditions meant a lot of stuff. The rules meant a lot. And so Euripides was considered very dangerous and radical as a writer, which is why most of his works have survived today when many of the others have not. The other is, and let me also say that structure of tragedy carried on into more modern times. You can see those same structures involved in Shakespeare and things like Hamlet and things like King Lear. You can also see it come all the way down into the American tragedies. We look at the great works of people like Arthur Miller, Eugene O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, the sort of Southern Gothic tragedies and dramas. You see those same ideas of a person with fundamental flaws and their ultimate unraveling and demise, especially when you take that and mix it with things like the idea of the American dream, which was happening in the mid-20th century. So playwrights like Eugene O'Neill and Arthur Miller really glommed onto that as a concept and wrote very well about it, and wrote what many people would call our American masterpieces. And those structures are still there. The other one is comedy. And comedy's been popular ever since its very inception in the ancient times. Comedy tends to differ historically from tragedy in that it is about normal everyday people and normal everyday problems. They are also typically, at least in historical terms, when you look at things like early farce and Greek comedy and Roman comedy, extremely lewd, extremely crass in the way that they talked about issues that were going on, but they did it in ways that we might call satirical, or in ways to make fun of things that were actually really serious. Because they are about everyday people and everyday issues, they tend to be more contextual to the times of what was going on, and so they tend to lose their popularity faster, or their fundamental strength of what they're saying faster than the great tragedies, which we still see, which tend to deal with more fundamental human truths and bigger ideas, sort of macro ideas. So they tend to be more longer lasting. Obviously, there's other ways to classify things, but that's kind of the basis of the way that we start talking about classifying plays by duration and genre. You've got things like melodrama, tragic comedy, satire, musicals, but even in those, we can subdivide them even further by whether it's more serious or more humorous. And so tragedy and comedy really, those rules really do kind of go throughout the whole history of theater. Oh, that's a lot of wind. Wow, that's wind. Sorry about the wind, y'all. Okay, so let's talk about the construction of drama very quickly, the way that performance is put together. As stated before, a play is a series of dramatic actions with purpose, right? That's what separates it from just sport or from playing, as we talked about in the last chapter. But that purpose creates what we call a pattern, right? Unlike the action of a soccer game, which they're using strategy and formations and stuff, but you don't know where the ball's going to go next, right? There's not a preordained pattern to the way it's going to go. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. We don't know what the outcome of a street riot is going to be, or what the outcome of an election is going to be, right? There's a part of it that is structured, but there's a part of it that is unknown. It's different with a play. Dramatic action has clearly identifiable components and a specified beginning, middle, and an end. Like we said last time, we always know that Hamlet's going to die in the end. We always know it. Even when a drama or a comedy is improvised, like in Commedia, right? Dramatic action still tends to be crafted in a well-understood compositional pattern, right? It's got purpose. That purpose is real important. That's what separates it from other things. So we can think of it, and I like the way that the book talks about this in terms of what we call like a horizontal and a vertical axis, right? So like one thing is like the aesthetical structure of a play, and the other would be like the architectural structure of a play. Both of those things have to work together in order to craft dramatic action and craft the drama of a play and the structure of a play. So if we look at the vertical axis, we kind of come back again to Aristotle. Some of those different component parts are things like plot, characters, themes, diction, right? Let's talk about plot for a second. It's real important. Plot is not just a story, right? A plot is the mechanics of the story. That's very important. It's the sequence of things that happen and why they happen in that sequence, right? And it can't be understated how important that is, or overstated how important that is. It is a sequence of comings and goings. It's a timetable of events. It's the ordering of the revelations and the reversals and the fights and the discovery and so on and so forth, right? And the primary demands on those plots are logic and suspense, meaning that when we do all that stuff, it matters that the actions that are portrayed are plausible, right? Meaning they have to follow one another in a way that makes sense, that are organic, and that they are credible, and that they also set up expectations for further actions. Talk about creating suspense. They set up expectations for further actions as we move through the play. So one thing kind of begets another thing. That's plot. Bye-bye. Right? Bye-bye. That's plot. And it's real important to understand that. It's a very specific functioning thing. Characters are another part of the vertical axis, right? What is a character? Well, the basic way to define a character is the idea of a set of needs and wants and desires, right? Set against a set of given circumstances that create obstacles, that impede that character acquiring those needs, wants, or desires. Good character depth. Good characters are written with complexity of desires and with the consequences of how they go about getting those desires. That's what marks a really good character. It's psychological depth. It's not just external. There's also theme and diction, right? So a theme would be like, it's abstract intellectual content. I love that phrase from the book. I think that's interesting. The way I think about it, though, is like, when you talk about the theme, what is the central truth that you're trying to go after? What's the cosmic truth? Now, in dramatic writing, we call that premise, right? What is the cosmic truth the play is trying to say about the world, about humanity, about time, about whatever it might be? Every play has one. And it's a director's job, right, to find that when they're putting their play together. If you don't find it, then the play won't make any sense. You got to find what the central truth of the play is. What's the playwright trying to say when they wrote this play? Now, diction is not just about the pronunciation of language. It's about rhythm. It's about tone. It's about cadence. And it's not just on the playwright to create that. The actor participates in that as well. Couple others that are important on the vertical axis would be music and spectacle. Again, these are all parts of what Aristotle suggested were the component parts of a good play. Right? This stuff's been involved for a long time. Music is can be the heartbeat of production. The way that you want to hear sound, the way that you experience the aural qualities of a play, extremely important. Now, in ancient times, they were chanted or sung. The dramas were. So music and sound was an integral part of the way that a play was delivered. And it's a little bit different than the way we understand it today, but nevertheless, it's really important. And finally, spectacle is just the visual elements of the play, right? The scenery, the costumes, the lighting, the makeup, whatever it might be. You've got an audience experiences a play not just the way they listen, but what they see. The way that it hits them. And so all of that stuff, those things are aesthetic. Those things are about experiential, the experiential side of a play, right?